There's a certain kind of magic you can feel long before you ever see it. The kind that lives in hand painted forests, in the rustle of wind through tall grass, or in the quiet bravery of a kid who decides to keep going even when the world asks too much of him. For decades, that kind of magic belonged almost entirely to Studio Ghibli, and for just as long, it stayed nowhere near video games. It wasn't that Ghibli disliked games, not really. It's just that their stories wandered, lingered, and breathed in ways early games couldn't. Their worlds weren't built on systems or strict choices. They were shaped by feelings, contradictions, and the messy human parts of growing up. So when conversations drifted towards game development, Ghibli usually drifted the other way. But every now and then, the right story can bridge even the widest gaps. In the late 2000s, Level 5 approached Ghibli with a project that wasn't built on combat or efficiency or branching routes, but on heartbreak, hope, and the quiet courage of a child trying to find his way forward. A story where magic wasn't an escape, but a way to process grief. A world that didn't need to be conquered, just understood. And for the first time, Ghibli didn't step back. They leaned in. What followed wasn't a brand partnership or a marketing play. It was a true collaboration, a melding of hand drawn emotion and modern game design, the kind of unlikely creative fusion that almost shouldn't work, but absolutely does. Today, we're using the release of Ni no Kuni, Dominion of the Dark Djinn, which debuted on December 9th, 2010, to talk about how Studio Ghibli finally stepped into the world of video games, and how that step led to one of the most heartfelt RPGs of its era. On today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 276th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are using the release of Ni no Kuni, Dominion of the Dark Djinn, which debuted this week in 2010, as our starting point to explore one of the most unlikely and heartfelt collaborations in gaming history. We'll look at how Studio Ghibli, a company famously cautious about video games, found common ground with Level 5, and how that partnership blended hand drawn emotion with modern RPG design to create a story about grief, growth, and the quiet courage of a child trying to understand his world. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co host, a man who would absolutely spend half the adventure chatting with Drippy instead of saving the world. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, do you think you'd actually save the day in Ni no Kuni, or would you just end up trying to collect every familiar this side of Motorville?
Well, if there's any kind of collection log, I ain't never finishing the game.
You don't do collection, do you?
Oh, I that's my problem is I start to and then I get burnt out and don't finish the actual game.
Yeah, I feel that. That is absolutely it must be a family trait, is what I'm trying to say, because I have the same problem in so many games. On a positive note, it is Motorville, so hometown, right? We're on familiar territory. We're on our own turf.
Close enough.
We're also joined today by Ryan Shepard, who, let's be honest, would get emotionally attached to every single familiar and refuse to let any of them evolve. Ryan, are you ready to journey into heartbreak, hope, and maybe a little grinding?
I was led to believe this was a family program.
Well, we have news for you.
You've been here quite a few times. This is not your first episode. I don't know who led you to believe that when, but I would have done think that ship has sailed.
If we're grinding, okay, I'm here for it.
Okay. Uh, Ryan, have you played through any of the Nino Kuni games?
Yes, I played through the PS3 version of Nino Kuni Wrath of the White Witch.
So we have a Wrath of the White Witch player. Rob, any familiarity with the series?
Nino, sir.
Nino, sir. Got it. Fantastic. Ryan and I have both played Wrath of the White Witch, so hey, some familiarity. We're all not going into this blind. Great story. We'll talk about how the two studios, they're both studios in their own respect, one just animation, one video games, how they came together and found common ground. But before we get into that story, Rob, why don't you tell our listeners what else has happened during this current week in gaming history?
Kicking it off on December 9th, 1988, Ninja Gaiden was released for the Famicom, or the NES, in Japan, developed and published by Tecmo. This groundbreaking action platformer introduced players to Ryu Hayabusa, a young ninja on a quest for revenge and justice, and became famous for its fast paced combat, tight controls, and brutal difficulty. Ninja Gaiden also set itself apart with cinematic storytelling through animated cutscenes, which was an innovative technique at the time that helped define the narrative style of future console gaming. Its punishing enemy encounters, memorable bosses, and iconic soundtrack cemented it as one of the NES's most influential titles. And we actually covered its story back in episode 27, so if you want to learn more about its legacy, go give it a listen.
God, that was so long ago. That was so
Uh,
long ago.
yeah.
That was one of the early episodes. That was when we were just trying to figure out the history thing. I remember telling that story and was like, "Ooh, it's one of the earliest games that has animation, like animated cutscenes." It The guy who made it wanted to be like a movie because there weren't really games or titles that were like movies at the time, you know? Ryan, did you ever play Ninja Gaiden back in the day?
Yes, I remember slamming my head against the wall so many times.
Oh my god, I know.
I got through maybe like 4 levels. I think I was, let's say, on the younger side, and let's say on the not so skilled side, apparently as well.
Well, I think the same can be said for all of us back when we were we were babies
Well,
when
hey
they,
now. Hold on. I wouldn't go that far.
we were
Now, that said, I do want Ryu to show up in Smash Brothers in some future entry.
all right. We can handle that. That
So
would be a
just
lot
put a
of
good
fun.
word in if you could.
Okay,
Yes, I'll
we'll
talk to
do.
my father who owns Nintendo.
Yes, we'll do that.
All right. Well, next up on December 10th, 1993, Doom was released for MS-DOS by id Software, igniting a revolution in PC gaming and forever redefining the first-person shooter genre. Dropping players onto the demon-infested moons of Mars, the game delivered blisteringly fast action, 3D environments, atmospheric sound design, and a level of violence and intensity that was unprecedented at the time. Doom also pioneered multiplayer deathmatches and popularized the shareware distribution model, helping it spread like wildfire across schools, offices, and homes. Its modability, thanks to WAD files, fostered one of the earliest and most influential modding communities in gaming. Universally praised for its innovation and impact, Doom became a cultural landmark and remains one of the most important and influential video games ever created. We covered its story back in episode 15, so give it a listen if you want to learn more. Go ahead, Dave, say it
I
again.
I opened my mouth about how I thought 27 was so long ago, and
Yep,
now here we
exactly.
are. Okay, I'll shut up. Wait,
Exactly.
okay, here's my anecdote for that one. I thought I was the coolest thing ever when I figured out how to mod the game with WAD files. That's it. I mean, I would have been like what 8, 9, 10 at the time, and I was like, "Ooh, I can hack the games and add new levels and do cool things." And I thought I was hot. I thought I was the next greatest hacker when I figured out how to do it.
Well, guess it got you started in the IT.
Yeah, yeah, gaming back when probably did. That's a very valid point. Having to figure out how to make every game work on DOS because we never had the greatest computer, so it was always like, oh, do doom.exe dash 16-bit graphics, or there was always little addendums onto the executable files to, to change things and make it work. And figuring out how that all worked with each computer was, yeah, a lot of fun, and probably early on, although yeah, I did basic earlier, but I appreciate that notion.
Well, that was a pretty basic response. And anyway, on December 11th, 1999, Gran Turismo 2 was released for the original PlayStation, developed by Polyphony Digital and published by Sony Computer Entertainment. Building on the groundbreaking success of the first game, Gran Turismo 2 massively expanded the series' scope with over 600 cars, 27 tracks, and a deep simulation mode that let players pursue licenses, upgrade vehicles, and compete across a wide range of racing disciplines. The game pushed the PlayStation hardware to its limits with improved physics, sharper visuals, and an unparalleled level of automotive detail for its time. Praised for its realism, extensive content, and redefined driving mechanics, Gran Turismo 2 became one of the console's defining titles and a landmark entry in racing game history.
I don't have anything for that.
It's a good game.
I played the heck out of the Gran Turismo. When they came out, we talked about this in the Gran Turismo episode. When they came out, technologically, they were like the greatest thing ever. Like I remember every iteration of Gran Turismo that came out, probably until 3 or 4. I think I lost interest about 4 cuz, technology changed. I would just sit there in awe of how realistic it looked. I, and that Yeah, that's it. I was just in awe. It was such a it was so revolutionary every time a new one came out.
Next up, on December 13th, 2002, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker was released for the Nintendo GameCube in Japan, developed and published by Nintendo. Departing from the series' traditional art style, Wind Waker embraced a bold, cel shaded aesthetic that brought its world to life with expressive characters, vibrant animation, and timeless charm. Players guided a young Link across the Great Sea, exploring a vast ocean dotted with islands while uncovering the mysteries of a world reshaped after the Great Flood. Though its visual direction sparked controversy prior to release, Wind Waker was praised for its emotional storytelling, tight combat, atmospheric sailing, and imaginative dungeon design. Over time, it became recognized as one of the most enduring and beloved titles in the franchise, later refined in the acclaimed HD remaster for the Wii U.
Ryan, I'm gonna open some space for you here as the resident Nintendo expert.
Yeah, a couple things here. Uh, First of all, I cannot imagine this game coming out today. From this perspective of the reaction to the Wind Waker when it was first released was so exceedingly negative.
Yep.
And can you imagine like the Twitter sphere in that environment? I think maybe as I say that, I think we're a little bit more accepting of different games. But at this point, the series has had so many different art styles, 2D, 3D, handful of cell shaded, etc. That you're always going to get, if you want a realistic one, it's going to be, on the next one, right? So,
Yeah, but consider what it follows is had I think everything to do with that, right? Like it it followed the Nintendo 64, the two of the greatest Zelda games ever, realistically.
yeah,
Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, right? Like that's what it followed. Am I missing one?
no, you're
Other than
exactly right. So,
the handheld titles, right? That's the
Majora's
I mean,
Mask was dark and ominous,
right. And
and
this was like completely the opposite.
right because after this there was the demo from the year 2000 that showed at was it E3 or no, it wasn't E3, showing Link and Ganondorf in kind of a intense sword clash, in a relatively gritty, realistic at the time tone. And then when the game was, unveiled as bright and cheerful and seemingly, bubbly, it was like, oh, well, that's a hard left turn from what players were expecting. But yeah, in hindsight, great game.
Very, very true. Rob, what else we got this week?
Well, last up for this week in gaming history, on December 12th, 2004, Sony Computer Entertainment launched the PSP, or the PlayStation Portable, in Japan, marking the company's first major entry into the handheld gaming market. Featuring a gorgeous widescreen display, powerful hardware, and multimedia capabilities, including music, movies, and internet browsing, the PSP delivered near console quality gaming on the go. Early titles like Ridge Racer and Metal Gear Acid showcased the system's graphical strength and unique design philosophy. Praised for its sleek aesthetic and versatility, the PSP became a significant competitor to Nintendo's handheld dominance, ultimately selling over 80 million units worldwide. Its legacy lives on through the Vita and Sony's continued emphasis on high quality portable experiences.
That's you. That's all
Yeah,
you.
I loved my PSP. It was a fantastic console or handheld. Well, it's a console, handheld console. I There was a Final Fantasy game. I believe it was called Dissidia. I played the shit out of.
You have spoken much about it. I was not part of that ecosystem in any way, shape, or form. I did work at that was when I worked at Best Buy. I sold the heck out of that thing. And those UMD, I don't know why I remember that they were UMD discs, Universal Media discs. Um, yeah, yeah, that was. Isn't that their only portable? No, now they have the
After the
Vita.
Vita,
Yeah. Yep, yep. Living La Vida Loca. Good Lord. Dork. All right, gentlemen. We've rambled on about the rest of gaming history for long enough. I think it's high and dry time we get into the topic discussion, eh? Meh, we could ramble on forever. No one would listen, but we could do it anyways.
no Kuni. Let's do it.
Gentlemen, when people talk about Studio Ghibli, they don't talk about it the way people talk about Disney, Pixar, or other animation studios, at least fans of Studio Ghibli, right? To them, Ghibli isn't just a brand so much as it's a feeling, right? The warmth of hand painted forests, the quiet hum of a world that feels lived in. You know, those small emotional moments that really stick with you years later. But this brand, so to speak, this incredibly distinctive identity didn't appear out of thin air. It grew, rather, from decades of creative philosophy, collaboration, and honestly, stubbornness, which I can relate with wholeheartedly. That's my MO.
Oh, really? Couldn't have guessed.
I know, right? Who knew? Who knew that I was a stubborn ass?
No one.
The roots of Studio Ghibli stretch back to the 1960s when Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata were young animators at Toei. They weren't icons yet, not the way we know them today, but they were already pushing for something different. And that was animation that treated children intelligently, tackled serious themes, and used fantasy not as an escape, but as a lens to understand real emotions. They worked together on Horus, Prince of the Sun, and later on shorts that were part of the Panda Go-Go series. And these were early signs of a partnership that would someday define the world of animation. Everything changed after 1984 when they put out Nausicaa of Valley of the Wind, basically. With strong support from Tokuma Shoten, that large backed largely by a producer there, Toshio Suzuki. That film, Nausicaa, was a critical and commercial success. Its impact convinced Takuma, the company, to help Miyazaki and Takahata create a proper home for their creative ambitions. So they pooled resources, acquired the assets of a struggling studio called Topcraft, and upon doing so, officially formed Studio Ghibli in 1985. From the beginning, Ghibli operated like an artisan workshop. Everything was hand drawn. Every frame, every background, every little painstaking detail. Even in the 80s, there were studios around them that were embracing computers, but Ghibli developed a philosophy of using digital tools incredibly sparingly, almost reluctantly. Miyazaki frequently rewrote storyboards in the middle of production, which didn't really make things easier, but it perfectly reflected Ghibli's eventual philosophy. Art comes first, everything else is negotiable. And that philosophy really shaped the studio's early works. Laputa Castle in the Sky showcased their sense of adventure. My Neighbor Totoro introduced a mascot recognized worldwide. Kiki's Delivery Service proved that Studio Ghibli could find magic in the ordinary. And Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies showed a profoundly different side of the studio, one willing to face heartbreak head on. I'm gonna take a moment right there because I named what are four of their perhaps some of their best known work. Are either of you Studio Ghibli fans? I'll start with you, Rob. Are you a Studio Ghibli fan?
I haven't watched extensively, but I do enjoy when I have watched.
So have you watched like the standards like Spirited Away, for instance?
Yes, yes, I
Howl's
have.
Moving Castle, like that?
Yes, yeah,
Okay, all
I've
right.
watched
Ryan,
the ones you named.
right. Ryan, what about you?
Pretty similar boat. Have certainly admired the work from a distance. Some of the ones that I have seen were I think the two that uh,
Yep.
Rob had
Yeah,
mentioned. Yeah.
they're the ones that were like when they got their partnership with Disney that came stateside and kind of a lot of us were introduced to Studio Ghibli when those ones came to the forefront. That's for sure. So I was just curious if either of you had a chance to peruse the rest of the library. Like Kiki's Delivery Service is a girl and a cat. We all know I've watched that one. So but Grave of the Fireflies in particular, if you've never had an opportunity to watch it, I would highly recommend doing so. It is one of the I know it's a cliche. It's right in the damn Wikipedia. It's one of the greatest animated films ever made. But it's not a feel good film, which is why I don't think it's as popular. It's the story of struggle, and it is brutal. Honestly, it's brutal, but it's beautiful, and honest to God, one of the greatest things I've ever seen in animation. So if you've ever had an opportunity, I would highly suggest it. By the late 90s and early 2000s, Studio Ghibli had become an international force. As we had just talked about, they found a distribution partnership with Disney that brought films like Spirited Away to the world. Spirited Away ended up earning them an Academy Award. Eventually, they opened up the Studio Ghibli Museum in 2001. And with that, their work was celebrated as something more than just commercial art. But as this is all happening, while Studio Ghibli's reputation was growing globally, the studio itself remained famously protective of its identity. After Nausicaa was heavily edited for Western release, they implemented a strict no cuts policy. It was awful. The Western version of Nausicaa is notoriously bad. So they kept licensing limited. They carefully controlled tie ins. And while they did accept commercials and small side projects, they approached larger collaborations with extreme caution. And when it came to our specific medium, video games, that caution became even more pronounced. Now, the internet loves to repeat the idea that Hayao Miyazaki hates video games. But like most things involving Miyazaki, the truth is a little more nuanced. I combed the internet because I wanted to know where this came from because I have always heard the same thing. Miyazaki hates video games. Miyazaki hates video games. And I basically went through our Google and Japanese Google and everything I could get my hands on. I wanted the direct quote, show me where Miyazaki hates video games. And the truth is, I never found it. I never found a direct quote at all. What I did find that is incredibly interesting was a 1992 interview in one of the magazines. I forgot the name of it. I feel dumb now, but that's okay. It was one of the magazines owned by the company that funded the studio, right? Which was Takuma, and Shigeru Miyamoto, like the famous Shigeru Miyamoto sat down and interviewed Miyazaki. That it was like a feature that was like the two heavyweights having a sit down, right? Like the video game guru and the film guru. And honestly, like it blew my mind when I found this interview because the thought that that exists somewhere is the coolest freaking thing ever. I loved it. Thankfully, even though it's in a Japanese magazine, there's a fantastic YouTube video that I will put on our show notes where a gentleman went through and translated it and did the voices and everything. It's honestly really fantastic. So we got to find out what those two talked about, what these heavyweights of their industries got to talk about. And in this 1992 interview, Miyazaki admitted that he didn't really play video games. He'd watch his son from behind, but he joked that he would lose so quickly if he did play that he really had no real interest in playing. And then he explained why video games didn't resonate with him. And I think this is where the nuance lives. This is where the hates video game idea comes from. To Miyazaki, games and films function fundamentally different. In a film, or as he put it, a drama, characters can make the wrong decisions. They can try something impossible for no logical reason. They can fail, fall apart, recover, and succeed through moments of chance, emotion, or sheer human messiness. Stories can take surreal turns because that's what emotions do. In his words and his view, that is very different from video games, where progress in a video game typically requires correct choices and predictable systems. So, in Miyazaki's mind, that difference wasn't just a little difference, it was foundational. Now, I think that's really interesting, and I want to take a moment and talk about that. Ryan, I'll start with you. What do you think about his? What do you think about that?
Eh, we're sitting here talking about these two legends, right?
Hmm.
Gameplay and story. Can you imagine a world where they were able to bridge that difference and build something together?
I think that would be phenomenal. I think they did a little bit of that in this interview, which we'll get to in just a second. But I think that this conversation's changed a little bit too. Rob, what do you think about that notion that video games are different and that you can't make the same mistakes as you can in movies?
I mean, at the end of the day, are they not both scripted?
They are both scripted. They are both scripted,
So,
but Ryan, since I didn't get back to you, like I guess the thing that I'm looking for, I'm not looking for anything. Looking for is a little different. I get it, right? Like his notion is that in a video game you can't progress with failure. There is no, when you gamify something, there has to be a loop where you grow, where you succeed, where you progress. That's the concept of a game. You progress, you grow, you win, right? You win a game. And you can't do that through failure. Like there just isn't, I'm racking my brain here trying to think of a game that rewards failure, but even in a game that rewards failure, you're still getting rewarded, so it's not technically failure anymore. They may play on that trope, but it just can't exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm wondering how how their thoughts may have changed over time. Specifically, video games of the mid 1980s versus even 20 years later, let alone here where we are, in more recent times, where being able to incorporate, emotionality and complex, interesting stories is a lot more commonplace versus just, hey, we're playing Pac-Man and just trying to get to the next level.
And I think that's a valid notion to make, and why I said I do think this conversation's changed because I think And we know he did in some ways. I think Miyazaki would have felt way more comfortable within the narrative structures of modern video games because they allow for so much more complexity. And there is a lot more room for failure, just not in the end. You look at a game like, for whatever reason, The Last of Us came to mind, and in particular, The Last of Us 2. The Last of Us 2, spoiler alerts if you haven't played it, there's a lot of loss in The Last of Us 2. And it is brutal and it is heartbreaking. And even in the very end, you are still dealing with a very brutal reality of the situation that the main character is in. Now, for it to be a game, you can't lose that. You can't die. So in the end, we're right back to the same conversation. But I think there's a lot more room for I think there's a lot more room for the types of narrative that he was thinking about back here in 1992. Let's remember that Miyazaki is the same filmmaker who said that heroines shouldn't need a savior. He's the same filmmaker who builds stories around environmentalism and pacifism, empathy, and inner transformation, and that those values don't map neatly onto traditional game structures, especially not, as Rob put it, the games of that time. One of you, sorry, was it Rob? It was Rob.
It was.
Especially not the games of the early 90s, as Rob put it. But what's even more interesting about this 1992 article is that Miyazaki did once describe the kind of game he would make. This one's for you, Ryan. And it was absolutely wild. He imagined, and he told this whole story in this article, it was a World War II story where the player could choose to engage in battle or become a conscientious objector. You could try to shoot down planes, you could walk away, you could starve, you could be captured, and all of it would unfold through hand drawn animation with branching consequences. It was morally complex, emotionally heavy, and decades ahead of his time. Because as we just talked about, that type of complex narrative structure where you had branching narratives and you had choices where it wasn't open world, so to speak, that didn't exist when they sat down in 92. It exists now. I think there's a lot of room for what he wants now, but it didn't exist back then, right? He acknowledged the problem at the time with making it, that it would burn out animators as he saw it because every narrative branch would need to be redrawn by hands. And I think the thing that I learned by reading this and by reading some other interviews, trying to get to the bottom of where this Miyazaki hates video games notion comes from is I don't think that Miyazaki hated video games. I just think that he saw video games as a medium that pushed against everything he valued about storytelling and everything that defined Studio Ghibli because his values had no place in that medium. And I think that's important to understand because that philosophy helps explain why for decades the studio stayed out of the gaming industry. Now, their characters did appear in a few early computer games. There were titles based on Nausicaa, Castle in the Sky, Kiki's Delivery Service, even a Porco Rosso PC adventure. But none of these were Studio Ghibli productions. They were outsourced to other studios, they were loosely licensed, and they often resembled generic platformers or educational software that kind of dominated the time period that they all were made in. They notoriously lacked Ghibli's themes, its emotional complexity, and its deliberate pacing. They were more tie ins and not collaborations. So, for a long time, it genuinely seemed like Studio Ghibli and the game industry would remain separate worlds. One prized interactivity and player agency, while the other was genuinely devoted to carefully authored emotional journeys. One leaned into technology, the other resisted it. One centered on systems, the other centered on feelings. And this notion, the notion that these two existed in these separate worlds is exactly what makes today's topic, the creation of Ni no Kuni, so fascinating. Because the studio didn't suddenly change their mind about video games. Someone finally approached them with a project that they felt aligned with their values. It was a story built not around correctness or efficiency, but emotion, grief, wonder, and growth. All the things that Studio Ghibli cared about the most. And that someone was Level 5. After decades of the studio keeping the game world at arm's length, the breakthrough didn't come from Hollywood or a publisher or some massive cross media pitch. It came from a game studio celebrating its 10th anniversary, a studio that, in its own way, had been chasing the same emotional territory that Ghibli had explored for decades. By 2008, Level 5 had made its name by doing something deceptively difficult, and that is creating games that felt warm, approachable, and emotionally resonant. Dragon Quest VIII proved that they could deliver big worlds full of charm. Professor Layton, which we've done an episode on, proved that they could tell heartfelt stories through simplicity and elegance. And when Akihiro Hino sat down to decide how to celebrate a decade in the industry at the forefront of Level 5, he didn't want a flashy spectacle or a technical showpiece. He wanted to build something meaningful, something about childhood, loss, and courage. Something that made players feel the way that Studio Ghibli films made him feel. That idea became the first Ni no Kuni, a Nintendo DS project rooted not in combat or scale, but in a simple emotional premise. Spoiler alerts, there's a grieving boy named Oliver, a stuffed toy who turns out to be a fairy, and a parallel world where his mother's soulmate might still be alive. That pitch was spiritually aligned with Ghibli long before Ghibli was involved. And then the luckiest coincidence in Ni no Kuni's entire history happened. Musician Naoya Fujimaki, who worked with both companies, introduced Hino to Studio Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki. And the timing was impeccable. The studio had just wrapped up production on Ponyo. Their animation team, including their legendary animator Yoshiyuki Mimose, was suddenly available. So Hino shared the idea. It wasn't a tie in, it wasn't an adaptation, not even a marketing partnership. It was a story, a pitch about grief and empathy, imagination, and finding one's way after tragedy. And Suzuki saw the vision immediately. This wasn't a game trying to imitate Ghibli, it was a game whose heart already beat like a Ghibli film. That emotional alignment, not business strategy, not brand synergy, is what finally opened the door that Ghibli had kept closed for decades. Now, from there, the partnership grew quickly. Ghibli approached the game as if it was one of their films: storyboards, acting direction, hand drawn keyframes, meticulous attention to natural movement. Suzuki expected just a few months of work. Instead, it became a major production for the studio, the kind of project that required full commitment. While Ghibli shaped the animated sequences, Level 5 built a DS game unlike anything else on the system. It shipped with a 352-page physical spellbook called The Magic Master because the team wanted kids to feel like they were actually learning magic. To solve puzzles, players flipped through diagrams. To cast spells, they drew runes on the touchscreen. To understand the world, they treated the book as a real artifact, just as the main character Oliver would. And while the DS hardware limited visual fidelity, it didn't limit emotion. The towns were designed to feel cozy and alive. NPCs needed help restoring literal pieces of their heart, tying gameplay directly to emotional healing. Battles introduced the Imogen system, early prototypes of the familiars that would define the series. Everything about this story and its design centered on Oliver's growth, not as a hero, but as a child navigating grief, finding courage, and learning to stand on his own. When Ni no Kuni Dominion of the Dark Djinn launched on December 9th, 2010, Japan embraced it immediately. 170,000 copies in 3 days, 330,000 copies in a month, over 500,000 copies within a year. Critics praised its earnest storytelling, warm presentation, and unmistakable Ghibli influence, even in a limited Nintendo DS package. But even as the DS version released, the collaboration was already expanding. Level 5 and Studio Ghibli were building something bigger, a PlayStation 3 adaptation that wasn't just a port, but a complete reimagining. The next version would bring in a full orchestrated score, fully realized animation, and a world that blended film quality cutscenes with gameplay so seamlessly that critics would later call it the closest thing gaming has ever produced to playing inside a Studio Ghibli movie. That a fair statement, Ryan?
At the time, yeah, certainly. It was, living and breathing. It was like a, beautiful cell shaded dreamscape almost.
That is very true. But before that sweeping cinematic adventure could exist, this closest thing gaming has ever produced to playing inside a Studio Ghibli film, it began with Dominion of the Dark Djinn, a small, heartfelt DS game, the game that ties together this current week in gaming history, the game that made Level 5 and Studio Ghibli realize that they were perfect partners. You know, Rob, what I love about Nino Kuni is how something small and heartfelt grew into something cinematic. How Level 5 and Studio Ghibli took a simple beginning and turned it into a fully realized world. And honestly, that's what starting a podcast feels like when you got the right tools.
Right. You don't need a full orchestra or Ghibli's animation team. You just need a place to begin.
Exactly. And that's why I use Zencaster. It's the all in one podcasting platform that makes recording incredibly easy. You just log in through your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. No complicated setup, no magic wand required.
Okay, but what if something breaks? Even Oliver had to worry about losing pages from his wizard's companion.
Well, that's where Zencaster shines. It has multi layered backups, so even if your internet hiccups, your recordings stay safe and the highest quality. Nothing gets lost on the journey.
And editing? Please tell me I don't need to cast a spell just to clean up my audio.
Not at all. Zencaster's post production tools automatically remove background noise, trim filler words, and balance your levels so you sound polished every time. It's like having a tidy little familiar doing cleanup for you.
Okay, but once I finish my masterpiece, how do I get it out there? Not everyone has Studio Ghibli distributing their work.
Well, that's one of the best parts. Zencaster also helps you publish your podcast directly to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the major platforms. From recording to release, everything happens all in one place.
So, podcasting without the spellcasting complications. I like it. How do our listeners get started?
Go to zencaster.com/pricing, use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you've been thinking about telling your own story, now is the perfect time to begin.
So, grab that discount and start your own adventure. No grimoire required.
That's right. Head over to Zencaster, use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month.
And now, let's turn the page and move into the PS3 chapter.
So if Nino Kuni Dominion of the Dark Djinn was the spark, then Wrath of the White Witch was the moment that the whole thing caught fire. What's funny is that even before the DS game launched, Level 5 and Studio Ghibli were already deep into creating something much bigger. Not a port, not an enhanced version, but a full scale reimagining of the world they just built. One designed specifically to answer a very simple question: what if you could actually step inside a Studio Ghibli film? That was the dream. And it was a dream that demanded a lot more than a handheld system could offer. The DS version had charm, it had heart, it had a clear creative identity, but the PlayStation 3 just gave them room to expand, not just visually, but also emotionally. It wasn't just about making things prettier. It was also giving the story room to breathe, letting the characters move more naturally, and building a world big enough to match the studio's imagination. And that meant bringing the studio even deeper into the fold. Yoshiyuki Momose returned as animation director and didn't treat this like game work. This was more so a feature film to him. They storyboarded out every single scene. They did motion capture settings that were directed the same way he would direct actors in a movie. And because real human movement doesn't translate perfectly into Studio Ghibli's softer, choppier animation style, the team kind of had to manually work and adjust the data. Step by step, frame by frame, they adjusted walk cycles, running animations, little moments where a character shifts their weight. Momos had opinions of all of it. Meanwhile, Level 5's art team pretty much lived inside Studio Ghibli movies for months. They watched them constantly. They studied everything: how shadows would fall across a character's face, how light scatters across watercolor backgrounds, how Ghibli's cameras barely move unless the moment truly calls for it. They weren't just trying to draw in the style of the studio, they were trying to understand why Ghibli looks the way it does. And then there was the music. On the DS, the score had to fit within the limitations of the hardware, but on the PS3, you finally had the tools, the memory, and an orchestra, literally the orchestra. They brought in the Tokyo Philharmonic to create something sweeping and cinematic. It wasn't just a soundtrack, it was a heartbeat, it was a film score. You can feel it the second the title screen loads. And in the PS3 version, the story was able to grow too. The emotional bones were the same. There's a grieving boy, a parallel world, and a journey towards maturity. But the PS3 version just let Level 5 expand everything around those ideas. The towns became fuller, the characters gained more personality, and the emotional beats just hit harder. The familiar system was redesigned to feel like something more out of a Ghibli film, which meant that some of the early creature designs had to be scrapped entirely because they were too weird or too cute. Motorville, which was called Hotroit in the DS version, was reimagined as a nostalgic snapshot of 1950s American car culture, all because Oliver is a kid who loves machines. And that small detail spiraled outward into the broader theme of the game. When you're young, the whole world feels like a machine with more moving parts than you understand. Nino Kuni Wrath of the White Witch leaned into that feeling, using its two world structure to reflect how children process grief, responsibility, and the weight of growing up. And while all this artistry was happening, Level 5's programmers were fighting their own battles. Contour lines and shell shading are hard. Getting them to function stably is even harder. Oliver's cape apparently caused weeks of headaches, half math, half hand drawn tweaks, just to get it moving in a way that looked natural but still in the Studio Ghibli style. Even blending Ghibli's hand drawn cutscenes with real time gameplay took enormous coordination. The team's goal was for the player to not notice the seams. The problem was the seams were everywhere. And then came the localization. This wasn't just a translation, this was an expedition of sorts. It took over a year. The script is huge. Every joke, every pun, every dialect had to be rethought. Drippy alone required a complete personality rebuild in English, which is how the team ended up giving him his current Welsh accent. Hino himself has said that this process was one of the trickiest parts of the entire project. Even animations had to be changed, like Oliver's bow, because original cultural gestures wouldn't read the same to a Western audience. So they completely reworked the game when they did the localization. But in the end, everything worked. In Japan, Wrath of the White Witch debuted strong. In the West, it arrived kind of a revelation of sorts. It was a modern JRPG that felt warm and earnest and deeply human at a time when the genre was struggling with identity. Critics loved it, fans loved it, I loved it. Ryan, you loved it?
Loved it.
Loved it. And for many players around the world, Nino Kuni became their first window into the emotional vocabulary of the studio. And in that moment, when we got Wrath of the Witch, the whole collaboration stopped being a DS experiment or a one off anniversary project. It turned Nino Kuni into a world, a brand, a franchise with room to grow. Once Wrath of the Witch proved that Nino Kuni wasn't just a one off collaboration, the natural question became what's next? And the answer really surprised people because the next big Nino Kuni game didn't include Studio Ghibli. Not directly the way the first one did, at least. When Nino Kuni 2 Revenant Kingdom was announced in 2015, a lot of fans assumed it would be a reunion, with Ghibli animators back in the fold, the orchestra back, Momo supervising every frame, but Level 5 made a very deliberate choice here. They wanted to build a sequel that wasn't dependent on Ghibli's hand drawn animation pipeline, something that allowed them to use what they learned while also having the opportunity to step out of Studio Ghibli's shadow. And so, even without the studio's direct involvement, to be fair, you can still feel the Ghibli DNA all over Revenant Kingdom. It's got the same warm colors, the gentle character arts, a sense of optimism that floated above even the darker moments. The music carries all of the emotional continuity like it did in the first, let's be fair, couple of games. But this was truthfully Level 5's world now. It was playing by their rules, playing within their characters at their pacing. If you've never played the second one, it follows Evan Pettiwisker Tildrum, a young king who's forced to rebuild his kingdom after a coup. Instead of a coming of age story about grief and empathy, Revenant Kingdom becomes a story about leadership, about how you build a community, how you earn trust, and what it means to lead with compassion. The tone was different. It is more political, but also more hopeful. It is less introspective than Oliver's journey, but still framed with the same belief that kindness can change the world. And from the gameplay standpoint, Level 5 absolutely swung for the fences. They reworked battles into more fluid action combat. They introduced a kingdom building simulation. And then they added the Higgidies, these little tiny elemental spirits that look like they stumbled straight out of a Ghibli concept sketch. So, like I said, the DNA of the Ghibli DNA is still in there. On paper, it was a sequel with bigger ambitions, right? And while reviews varied a bit more this time, the game found its audience. It was players who wanted something lighter, cheerier, and more adventurous than the first game's bittersweet tone. But the expansion of the series didn't stop there. In 2021, Nino Kuni Crossworlds launched, this time as a mobile MMORPG developed by Netmarble under Level 5 supervision. And this is kind of where Nino Kuni as a franchise really stretched its identity. Instead of a traditional JRPG, Crossworlds leaned hard into multiplayer systems that included class roles, open world exploration, and long term progression. The interesting thing about Crossworlds is that it's not just Nino Kuni the MMO. It actively plays with the concept from the first game, that idea of parallel worlds, that theme that was baked into the DNA of the series from the very beginning. The game literally frames the player as someone entering a virtual reality project called Soul Divers, which really blurs the line between simulation and reality. It's a very Nino Kuni concept, even if the gameplay itself is shaped by mobile design and MMO structure. And visually, Crossworlds is very different from the rest. The Studio Ghibli didn't animate anything, but Netmarble's team took the earlier inspirations and really leaned on the studio's color language, shapes, proportions. They borrowed their pacing to craft something that really looks like it still belongs in the same universe. It's Even though Studio Ghibli's involvement in the series was long gone, everyone that took the helm afterwards, from Level 5 to Netmarble, they really worked hard to make sure that Studio Ghibli was never lost to the series. And that kind of brings us to the present. Nino Kuni sits here in a really interesting place. It's a franchise built on a moment of perfect alignment, a studio that didn't make video games, partnering with a developer who wanted to build something more emotional than a typical JRPG. And that collaboration resulted in more than just a pair of excellent games. It created a blueprint of sorts, a sense that games can be warm, gentle, sad, soft, hopeful, a creative fantasy that doesn't need to be cynical, and magic that doesn't need to come from darkness. It can come from sincerity. In 2019, Akihiro Hino said that a third mainline game was already in development. And honestly, I don't think he'd say something like that unless the studio was in the process of exploring something meaningful. Because Nino Kuni, it isn't really about wizards or familiars or parallel worlds. It's about growing up and meaning what you say. It's about choosing kindness. It's about rediscovering wonder in a world that often asks you to let go of it. And if there's anything that ties all of these games together on any platform, from the DS through the PlayStations into mobile, it's just that. It's that Studio Ghibli DNA. Nino Kuni didn't just succeed because it looked like a Studio Ghibli film, it succeeded because it felt like one.
Well said.
You want to have anything? Thank you for starters. Is there anything you want to add to that? You played through it. I loved the emotional beats of this game. You know I'm a softie, and it landed really well with me.
Yeah, no, it was a very, well done story. And I actually bought a PS3 because of this game.
Really?
Yeah. You know,
Nuts.
I kind of picked up on some of the hype after the fact and looked it up. It's like, well, I've been looking for an excuse to get a PS3, and I mean, to this day, that may have been one of the only games that I played to completion on the PS3.
That's great. That's fantastic. Yeah,
And
it's an
and yet
incredibly.
somehow I loved it, between the gameplay, the soundtrack, the story, all kind of coalescing, yeah, into this kind of warm, fuzzy, sincerity, like you had mentioned.
And
Um,
it felt like playing a Studio Ghibli movie.
yeah, and yet to this day, I've never played two, and as I continue to think about that, I just feel horrible.
Yeah, there's always time.
Yeah, maybe next year.
Maybe next year. Before we wrap up today's journey through the worlds of Nino Kuni, I want to remind our listeners that this isn't the first time we've crossed paths with Level 5 or their JRPG neighbors. If today's story has you hungry for more adventures born from quirky studios and heartfelt design philosophies, we've got plenty of other stories for you to explore. We dug into Level 5's roots way back in episode 77 when we talked about the puzzle solving charm and quiet whimsy of the Professor Layton series, the same creative DNA that eventually carried into Nino Kuni's warmth and world building. If you want to step even further back in time, we explore the origins of the JRPG Titan that shaped the entire genre, Dragon Quest, in episode 143, tracing how its blueprint would help define what Japanese role playing games would become. And if your heart beats for magical adventures across parallel worlds, as mine does, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that we took a full trip through Chrono Trigger in episode 50, one of the most beloved fantasy journeys ever carved into a cartridge. You can, of course, find all those episodes and plenty more anywhere you listen to your podcasts, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or by visiting our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
Well, you can find a calendar of our future episode topics, see what we'll be talking about. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I and other possible friends from the podcast. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to the unedited and ad-free versions of our episodes, know what goes on behind the scenes in production of your maybe favorite podcast. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor. Dave?
I can be found on various platforms as David is wrong, and if history tells us anything, is that Ryan likes to hide and never be found outside of this podcast. Side note on our website, it's live. All the changes that I've made recently, completely live. I was able to bring it live over last week. I will find mistakes. Let me know if you are checking it out. If you find mistakes, I'm doing my best. I'm combing through it. But I've been working for the last, what, 3 months now, probably, on completely revamping the website, changing the way it functions, and just, changing the way we present ourselves, and was finally able to bring that to fruition and move on to a different project recently. So check out our website if you haven't seen it lately. It's a whole new deal. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've even covered a few places before. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's this fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning, and in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I didn't know that this was a thing.
No?
I didn't know Ghibli had a game, so all of it was just a lot. It's pretty cool. Um, I really don't know that there's a specific thing. I think all in all, it was a very interesting story and kind of cool to hear that someone that I guess the big one thing is that you did the research and found that Miyazaki didn't hate games. Um, that's pretty monumental.
Yeah, I love digging into things. I love digging in. You already know that. You know how deep my deep dives go. They're my favorite parts. So, Ryan, what did you learn today?
Dave, you've really exposed my ignorance here on this series. I learned a number of things for the first time. Number one, I knew that there was a DS game. I did not know that it was the same game that I had played, just kind of the reimagined PS3 version. And I guess I didn't know about that primarily because apparently it was only released in Japan. Is that right?
That is, yes.
Yeah. Also, the fact that it shipped with a 350-page spell book, that is absurd to me. And I guess that helps make sense why it didn't ship to other territories, because I'm sure translating that would have been just as much work as the translation issues they had with the remaster.
Isn't that fun though? Like, just to think that in this day and age, I mean, Dominion of the Dark Djinn would have been 2010, and that's not that long ago. Like, and someone, I I think that I think that physical the physical part of video games is gone, right? We don't have releases that include physical media anymore the way we used to. So to think that there was a release like that that has this beautiful 300 and some odd page book that was integrated into the game, I think that's awesome. It reminds me a lot of the early days of uh, uh, copyright protection where you had to have the manual and look for like the third word on the 12th page type deal.
I
I
can
think that's
imagine it putting you really in the zone of the character, though. Hey, I'm Oliver. I've got my spell book in my freaking hand.
true.
Okay, let me look up to see how to cast that ruin.
True,
So cool.
true statement. I will say that without a doubt, finding that interview between Miyazaki and Shigeru Miyamoto would be absolutely be my favorite part of this. I just the thought that the two of them sat down, have a conversation that we were all privy to, I think is the coolest thing ever. Because even in '92, they were heavyweights. I mean, they were heavyweights of both their industries, both their respective companies, and their roles were riding high. And it's this rare time that we were able to witness a conversation between that interviews and that kind of stuff is really rare from Japanese developers in that time period. From the not like pre 90s, this is early 90s, but let's say early 90s, pre 90s and before, there is so little of that because they didn't do that. Magazines weren't prominent, and video game companies, Nintendo notoriously, it was incredibly protective of its image and did not allow for that kind of stuff to happen. So we don't have that kind of stuff. So to have that little snippet in time and then thankfully someone translated it, I just think that was so cool. I love it. That tickled me to no end when I wrote this episode. Alrighty. Before I wrap up this topic and look ahead to next week, is there anything? I'll start with you, Ryan, as our guest. Anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
If you have not played this game, give it a shot.
I
You won't
concur.
be disappointed if you
Have a heart.
have a heart. That's right.
If you have a
Also,
heart.
get yourself a drippy plushie.
Oh, yeah. Good call. Drippy plushie. Fantastic. Definitely a good call. Rob, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a quick moment to say thank you, Ryan, for joining us. And thank you to all of our listeners for listening to us. And thanks, Dave, I guess, too.
Yeah, I'm okay.
So, there you go.
That brings us to the end of our trip through the worlds of Ni no Kuni. And really, though, through a rare moment in gaming history when two creative philosophies managed to meet in perfect harmony. What stays with me is how unlikely this collaboration should have been. For decades, Studio Ghibli held games at arm's length, not out of disdain, but because they believed stories should wander, breathe, and take detours that don't always make logical sense, something that early video games just weren't built to do. Level 5, meanwhile, worked in a medium defined by structure, systems, and player choice. When these two worlds finally touched, something remarkable happened. Level 5 didn't force Studio Ghibli to become more game like, and the studio didn't try to reshape games into films. Instead, both sides leaned into what they did best and trusted the other to fill the spaces in between. The result was Ni no Kuni. It's a story that reminds players that adventure can be gentle, that grief can coexist with wonder, and that growing up doesn't mean letting go of magic. It showed that video games can carry the same emotional weight as hand drawn cinema, and that sometimes the boundaries between art forms aren't walls, but doors waiting for the right story to open them. In the end, Ni no Kuni isn't just the tale of a boy trying to heal a broken world. It's proof that when different creative traditions meet with respect and curiosity, they don't dilute each other, rather, they deepen each other. And that is a legacy worth remembering. Next week, we're leaving behind the warm whimsy of Ni no Kuni and blasting off into one of the most ambitious RPGs of the 1980s, Fantasy Star. Fantasy Star. Released in 1987 for the Sega Master System, this sci fi epic transported players to the Algol system long before space operas were common in gaming. With its vibrant worlds, first person dungeons, and a surprisingly emotional story led by one of gaming's earliest female protagonists, Phantasy Star pushed the boundaries of what an RPG could be on both a technical and storytelling level. So join us as we venture into its history, creativity, and legacy on next week's interstellar trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Ba-ba-dum-ba-ba-ba-doo-ah.